I'm joined by a trio of experts here today. Very exciting. I've got Sarah Kellerman with us and Scott Page. They are at Interface Studio, and Kevin Hively from Ninigret Partners. And we're going to talk about not just about an individual building, but a kind of issues related to streets and what's happening in downtowns and so forth. So you all came up with a document that you called the 4 R's: restart, reset, retool, and refit. What was that all about?
Sure. Thanks so much for having us. So we are frequent collaborators, Interface Studio and Ninigret, and in discussions over the last few months, we realized that a lot of the things that we were reading, a lot of the resources that we saw really weren't hitting advice for all different scales. Like you mentioned, there's advice out there for the scale of an individual building, activating public space, outside of an individual cafe, that kind of thing. And then there's sort of the 30,000 foot policy view, but there's not so much at the district level. So, experience tells us that even some of the policy ideas, 30,000 foot view or not, aren't really possible in all places. So we were kind of feeling this shift of energy from panic and triage to a real acknowledgement that there's a long road ahead and it's time to settle in, and we need to start thinking about longer term recovery. And we wanted to provide a tool that allowed that thinking at the district level and a little bit of a kind of a framework for how to approach that.
Kevin, what's going on with why are best practices not working?
Well, the first piece, Robert, is we don't know what best practices are right now to deal with the COVID situation, and particularly the post-COVID situation, because we've never been in this situation before. So everybody's kind of making things up on the fly, and we don't really know what's going to stick. But if you go pre-COVID, one of the concerns I've had for a really long time is that there's this tendency to want to know what best practices are, but in reality, they're kind of known practices, or they're the sexiest practice out there.
Give me an example. Give me an example.
Well, in the world of placemaking, the High Line is typically used quite a bit.
Okay.
Or downtown Greenville. They're both tremendously great assets, but there are some very unique circumstances about both of them, and they're very, very hard for a lot of communities to replicate. In the case of the High Line, it's New York City. It's the financial capacity of the philanthropic community is completely different. A project of that size and magnitude would be difficult for Boston to do, which is where I live, from a philanthropic perspective. In the case of Greenville, it was a very unique set of circumstances, a very unique set of situations with the leadership. They have a different kind of TIF structure that they can do that a lot of other places couldn't even do. And when they get rolled out, everybody goes, "Ooh, I want one of those," but then the actual ability to execute them become very difficult. And so that's why I'm not sure they're actually best practices. They're kind of the known practice, the sexiest practice. And what we really believe you have to think about, and particularly in the post-COVID era, is what are the right practices to do? What is going to work for the community in the case? And there's a series of issues. There's some very practical things, which is the geography, climate, and seasonality issues. So we have a package of the slide around seasonality that might be useful for your audience to see. There's some technical questions, which is around philanthropic and community support. And then there's the issues around TIF districts, and then there's organizational capacity issues. Not all the bids are equally strong. Not all the community development offices are equally strong. There's funding levels. Everything is very different. And then finally, just even the ability to do small business supports, like in Montgomery, Alabama. Montgomery, Alabama doesn't have a lot of the infrastructure that we talked about on the organizational side. So their ability to execute is very different than the ability of New York City, or even frankly, Grand Rapids, Michigan.
All right. So if you don't have best practices, where do you go? Scott, you got any thoughts on that? Do we have the data to do what we need to do here?
Not enough. And one of the great ironies is that we have perhaps more data than we've ever had, but it's difficult to access. And it lags. And so one of the things that we talk about frequently is that the impacts of COVID are happening every single day. Think about how different the world is from 6 months ago. But the data that we typically use to plan a downtown, to plan a main street, a commercial street, is at least 3 years old, sometimes 5 years old. So you're making decisions based upon older data. You are engaging people in the process, but we need up to date real-time data. And that means getting out there and really examining where you are starting from. I think too often we make assumptions about what we think is okay and not okay, and then jump in and start looking at best practices. What we really need is an honest assessment. Where are we today?
Okay. So Sarah, your report talks about the end of the beginning. What does that mean? What does that mean?
Well, I think what we mean by that is that there are going to continue to be closures and vacancies and job losses across employment centers and commercial corridors and downtown and Main
I
Street.
mean, it's brutal out there. It's brutal. I mean, you just walk past any strip commercial and it's terrible.
Yes, absolutely. But how long this goes on and how deep those impacts are is really a function of how well this period can be managed and how it impacts consumer confidence long term. And whether we're ready to respond. So it's really, it's less about being at the end of the beginning, and it's more about this idea that we're transitioning to the beginning of the end. And that's part of thinking differently about what we do now. And I think we introduce kind of the first floor problem, and that's an example of one of those things that really needs to be tackled.
First floor, who wants to talk about that?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. As someone that does a lot of planning, particularly for downtowns, the desire to put retail everywhere has been there in planning for a long time. I've seen lots of plans in the last even 10 years that have mixed use development throughout the downtown, and they struggled to support that retail then. It's even more of a struggle now. So if the ground floor isn't retail, what are we talking about? I think it's a design problem. It's a construction problem. It's an economics problem. Are we talking about designing buildings so that we have more multifamily buildings that have housing on the ground floor on the streets that are appropriate? Are we talking about lower cost office space or something completely different? But I think that's a real design and financing challenge. And it speaks to the need to collaborate with economists, with architects and planners to really solve and address these issues.
Where is Jane Jacobs when we really need her?
Exactly.
So this really does also get down to questions of equity. I mean, we're very much in the turmoils of dealing with equity issues in this country right now. How does all your 4 Rs, how do your 4 Rs play into that? Who wants to tackle that?
There's a lot written right now about the end of cities and the exodus of certain population groups out of the cities, and Manhattan is being used as the case example. And again, Manhattan is kind of a unique situation. Manhattan is obviously very different than Fargo, North Dakota, let's say. I mean, that kind of goes without saying, but there's this general thing. But what we have to remember is, and the profession's kind of done it to itself, is that we've done 2 things. One is we've taken millennials and we've frozen them in time. So we've looked at millennials as all millennials are 25 years old. The youngest cohort of the youngest part of the millennial cohort is now 25, 26 years old, and most of them are in their 30s. And the other thing that we've forgotten is that almost half, about 44, 45% of the millennials are actually minority. And of the millennials that live in cities, almost 60% of them are actually minority. But we haven't factored them into the population or the economic mix or the vibrancy mix and first floor mix, if you will, of a lot of these buildings. And I think what we're going to have to do going forward is make sure that we address the market that's there and not just the market that we would like to have.
Okay. All right. Well, it's been a great discussion, and we appreciate the time of Sarah Kellerman and Scott Page from Interface Studio and Kevin Hively from Ninigret Partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.